You spend enough time in psychiatric wards, and you come to understand a rhythm to human suffering. The sounds, the silences, the pacing, the sudden outbursts, they all mean something. Silence, in particular, in the psychiatric world, is never just quiet. It carries weight. But sometimes, something happens that cuts through all the clinical understanding, something that leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew. It happened with Mr. Langden. This wing had been part of the original hospital, built in the 1950s. He followed the routine when prompted. We'd conduct our standard verbal wellness checks, and he'd always meet us with that same blank stare or a slow nod. At first I thought it was one of the staff members talking to him, but when I opened the door, there he was sitting upright in his chair, hands folded in his lap, speaking. But he wasn't speaking to me. No distress, no aggression, just ... silence. And he was talking, not to me, not to anyone in the room. He was speaking as though in conversation, but not one-sided. He was responding to someone or something only he could see. His tone was calm, detached, conversational, no emotion in his voice, no distress, just ... engaged. The walls were thin, the floor tiles old. The rooms had high windows, small and barely giving a glimpse of the outside world. But he didn't even acknowledge me. His gaze never left the ceiling. I asked again. Every morning, around the same time, Mr. Langden would sit in that chair, staring up at that particular ceiling tile, speaking in full, clear sentences. Psychiatrists' evaluations came up. Empty, no medication changes, no signs of hallucinations or delusions. The conversations weren't fragmented or chaotic, like the typical disorganized thoughts we often saw in our patients. With schizophrenia, they were methodical, deliberate, as if he were responding to someone. But when we asked him who he was talking to, he would stop, fall into his usual mute state, and not respond for hours. This time, he simply raised his hand, signaling for silence, his eyes still locked on the same spot. Despite the age of the building, it had a strange aura, almost as if it had witnessed too many things that didn't belong in the world. I had worked in psychiatric care for over 25 years, state hospitals, locked wards, acute stabilization units, schizophrenia, catatonia, dissociative identity disorder. I've seen it all. He had a long history of severe trauma, institutionalized on and off since his 20s. He'd been placed under conservatorship with no known living relatives. When he first came to us, he was nonverbal. He could feed himself, nod, shake his head, but he refused to speak. His file indicated he'd been selectively mute for decades, likely as a result of his prolonged exposure to abuse and neglect. But Mr. Langdon's case was different. He didn't fit into any textbook diagnosis. His condition was unsettling. Mr. Langdon had been admitted to our facility in his late 50s. He was placed in room 212, a solitary confinement space in the far corner of West Hall. That was until Thursday, when everything changed. For the first year, nothing stood out about Mr. Langdon. We kept working with him, hoping that over time, we might gain some rapport. But for 13 months, he didn't speak a word. It was just past 10 a.m. when I walked past his door. I heard a voice. He was looking up at the ceiling, eyes fixed on one particular spat-old, worn ceiling tile near the back of the room, above his bed. I tried to gently redirect him, asking if he needed anything or if he was okay. Over the next few weeks, it became routine. The more we observed, the more the behavior seemed deliberate. There was nothing clinical we could use to explain it. His labs and imaging were all unremarkable. Our working theory was a rare form of post-traumatic recall behavior, perhaps a dissociative episode. While checking the tiles, they came to room 212. I let them in, not thinking much of it. Mr. Langdon was in an activity session in the common area, but no one could explain why it only occurred at that same time, every day, with such focus on that one ceiling tile. In the background I could just barely make out the corner of a restraint chair. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I recognized that face. One day, maintenance was called in to check for a leak in the air ducts above West Hall. It was faded and warped from age, but I could make out the image. A young man in his early 20s, seated on the edge of a narrow bed. The time stamped at the bottom read July 14th, 1974. Peaceful. We never documented it officially. It was one of those things you just couldn't explain. No one had an answer. No signs of distress. No waking. Like something or someone is still there, waiting. He simply didn't wake up one morning. It was as if it had been placed there recently, almost deliberately hidden. They removed the ceiling tile. Not just to the ceiling, he didn't respond at all. For days, he fell back into his mute state, staring blankly ahead, not acknowledging anyone who entered the room. You learn that silence doesn't mean absence, and sometimes, the past lingers in places you'd least expect. In the backside of a ceiling tile, or the memory of a room that never fully lets go. It was as if whatever conversation he had been having with the unseen presence had come to an abrupt end. He'd died violently in room 212, nearly 40 years earlier. I'd never worked with him, but I knew the case. He had reportedly hanged himself during a psychotic break, using a bedsheet while staff were rotating shifts. His death had sparked an investigation and led to the review of the hospital's restraint policies. The older nurses had whispered about him. His death had haunted the hospital's history. The moment it was taken down, something caught my eye. Polaroid photograph taped to the back of the tile. The man's face was vacant, disturbingly still, his expression almost frozen. A few of the older nurses did too. The man in the photograph had been a former patient. The photograph had never been mentioned in any records. None of the staff knew how it had ended up in the ceiling. But after the tile was removed, Mr. Langden stopped speaking. 3 months later, Mr. Langden passed away in his sleep. The room was cleared, the tiles replaced. But before they disposed of the ceiling tile, some of us made unofficial copies of the Polaroid. And after Mr. Langden passed, I never worked in room 212 again. But I still think about that photograph. And sometimes, when I walk past that wing, I can't help but feel a strange, unsettling presence. In this line of work, you learn to make room for what doesn't make sense. You know, Juve worked too long in a psychiatric facility when the line between what's real and what's imagined starts to blur. The stories we tell ourselves, the things we learn to ignore, it's all part of surviving the job. But every now and then, something happens that shakes you to your core, something you can't ignore, no matter how hard you try. I had worked in Ward 3B for nearly 10 years before it happened. Room 409. It had an old, outdated design, cracked walls, worn-out furniture, and a single narrow window high up on the wall. The room felt like a place where things were forgotten. Ward 3B was known for housing the most challenging cases, those patients who couldn't be managed elsewhere. Over the years, I'd learned to keep a thick skin. I'd witnessed terrifying things many times. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused, his hands were trembling as he gripped the window ledge. And then, just as I was about to ask if he was okay, he spoke. I stepped into the room slowly, trying to make sense of what was happening. Aiden turned his head toward me, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place: fear, recognition, maybe even relief. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I experienced with patient Aiden. Aiden was admitted about a year ago, diagnosed with severe dissociative identity disorder. They want me to join them. I can't escape them. He was in his late 20s, tall and wiry, with dark eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. The hospital was quiet, only the distant hum of the ventilation system breaking the silence. I took a few steps closer, my heartbeat quickening. The air in the room felt colder, and I noticed that his breath was becoming shallow, erratic. It was like something was happening in the room that I couldn't see, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I passed room 409 and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I rushed to his side, trying to steady him. He was trembling violently, his hands gripping the fabric of his hospital gown. It wasn't unusual for doors to be left open during the night shift, but something about this felt off. I stepped closer, listening. The air around me was thick, like the calm before a storm. His history was complicated: multiple attempts at treatment, several hospitalizations, but nothing had seemed to work. His behavior was typical for someone in his condition, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of it all. He wasn't violent, he wasn't agitated, existed. I would check on him during my rounds, but every time I entered the room, I felt an unease crawling up my spine. When he first came to us, he was nonverbal, unresponsive to any form of treatment. He had no family, no one to visit him. His file was sparse, and that always made me uneasy. Why was this young man so alone? Why was he so broken? He was placed in a secure room, one of the rooms at the end of the hall that was rarely used. For the first few weeks, Aiden remained silent, sitting on his bed, his eyes wide open but unseeing. Then, one night, everything changed. It was just after midnight, and I was making my final rounds for the evening. Inside, Aiden was standing by the window, staring up at the ceiling. "I'm not alone anymore." The words were faint, barely audible, but they sent a shiver down my spine. "Who are you talking to, Aiden?" I asked, my voice gentle. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, staring at the ceiling again, as though he hadn't heard me. Suddenly, Aiden dropped to his knees, his body convulsing slightly. "They're coming for me," he whispered, his voice hoarse, as if he were speaking through clenched teeth. I tried to calm him, but my words felt hollow, like they weren't reaching him. His eyes rolled back in his head, and for a brief moment, I saw something that wasn't him. His face twisted, and I could hear another voice. I had dealt with dissociative identity disorder before, but this was something else. A voice that wasn't his, whispering from somewhere deep inside him. "We're here," Aiden the voice said, almost lovingly. "Come back to us." I backed away, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I knew what I was hearing wasn't normal. I signaled for the ankle psychiatrist and 2 orderlies to assist. This time, when I entered the room, I noticed something else. The ceiling tile he had always stared at. It was missing. Just a hole, with an odd, dark stain around it. They arrived quickly, and we carefully restrained Aiden as he continued to scream, his voice becoming increasingly desperate. And then, one day, a nurse who'd been working in the ward for much longer than I had came to me with an old, worn notebook. "It's about the patient who was in that room before Aiden. Well, he didn't make it out either." She flipped it open to a page with a sketch of room 409, dated back over 30 years ago. The report was vague, but the details of his condition were unsettlingly similar to Aiden's. The words possession and voices were mentioned. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. "I won't go back. I won't go back," he cried, his body writhing against the restraints. They found nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. No new symptoms, no signs of seizure or psychotic break, no distress, no signs of a seizure or stroke. He simply didn't wake up. He stopped speaking entirely. His eyes were open, but he stared at nothing, as if lost in his own mind. And then, another strange thing happened. Just this. The psychiatrist examined him, noting his erratic behavior. But after several hours of monitoring, we couldn't find a medical explanation. The hospital went on as usual, but I couldn't forget room 4, or what had happened to Aiden. Something had happened in that room, something I couldn't explain. For the next few days, Aiden remained in a catatonic state. 2 days later, we found him sitting in the same position as before, staring up at the ceiling. I immediately called maintenance, who checked the area and confirmed that the tile had been replaced just a week earlier. Aiden never spoke again after that night. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and 3 weeks later, he passed away in his sleep, peacefully, without any explanation. After his death, we cleared out his room and prepared it for the next patient. I kept thinking about the missing ceiling tile, and that voice. That wasn't Aiden. "You might want to read this," she said, her voice low. The entry described a patient, a young man, who had died in that very room under mysterious circumstances. That night I sat in front of room 409, the empty room where Aiden had been. I've worked in psychiatric care for nearly 15 years. I've seen things that would make most people question their own sanitized sense locked in their rooms, screaming into the night, hallucinations that were so vivid they felt real. She was in her late 20s, with disheveled hair and wild eyes that seemed to be seeing something no one else could. It was at the far end of the hallway, near the old wing of the hospital where the newer additions met the aging infrastructure. The floor was old and cracked. The walls had that musty smell you only get from years of use. It was a room no one liked, but it was all we had. Her file said she had a history of severe depression, but there was much more. Emily had been mute for nearly a year. Her face was expressionless, her hands were folded in her lap, and she didn't react to anything. There was something unsettling about the way she stood, like she was waiting for something. As she looked at me, her lips parted, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped closer, trying to gauge if she was having a delusion, but as I reached out to touch her shoulder, she suddenly turned around. I was doing my rounds late at night, checking on the patients, making sure everything was calm. As I walked past room 15, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. The room was dark, save for the dim light coming from the hallway. No food, no water, no conversation. She became rigid, her body stiff, as though she were being pulled back toward the corner by some invisible force. I managed to get her back into bed and lock the door behind me, telling myself it was just the stress of being in the facility. She just stared at that same corner as if something in it had captured her attention. The sound was low, haunting a melody I couldn't place. It wasn't a song I recognized, but it felt ancient, like it came from somewhere deep in the building's walls. I tried speaking to her, tried offering food, asking if she was okay, but there was no response. It was like I wasn't even there. She never spoke, never communicated in any way, and when she arrived at our facility, her condition was dire. But there's one story, one case, that I can't shake. It's something I'll never forget, something I can't explain. Her name was Emily, and she came to us in the early spring, transferred from a facility upstate after she'd been found wandering the streets. She was placed in a quiet room, room 15. For the first few days, Emily just sat in her bed. It wasn't until the 4th day that things started to change. When I peered inside, Emily was no longer sitting on her bed. She was standing in front of the corner of the room, her head tilted slightly to the side, as though she was listening to something only she could hear. I pushed the door open gently, trying not to disturb her. I called softly, stepping into the room. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the corner. Her eyes, those eyes were filled with something darker than I had ever seen. Fear, no, something deeper. "I hear them," she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they pierced the silence like a knife. "Who do you hear, Emily?" I asked, my voice shaky, but she didn't answer. She simply turned back to the corner and began humming softly. I tried to pull her away, gently guiding her back to the bed, but she resisted. That night, as I walked down the hallway, I noticed something strange. The lights flickered briefly as I passed room 15, and I heard the faintest sound, the same, humming. But it wasn't coming from Emily's room. It was coming from all around the hallway. Her eyes were vacant, and she didn't acknowledge me when I spoke to her. For the rest of the day, she remained like that, silent and distant. I stood still, trying to figure out what it was, but when I glanced back toward the nurse's station, everything seemed fine. The sound was unmistakable, and it was coming from room 15. I rushed to her room, heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the door, I saw her standing again, this time facing the corner, her eyes wide open, as though she were watching something or someone. The humming stopped, and I chalked it up to exhaustion. The next day, when I checked on Emily, she was back to her non-responsive state. The figure remained in the corner, hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. It was as if the room itself had come alive. She would only speak in fragments, random phrases that didn't make sense, all pointing toward the same theme. "I hear them." A former patient, years ago, had died in room 15, under strange circumstances, a similar case of nonverbal behavior. And after Emily's passing, we knew the truth. The ward was haunted. They carry the past with them, hidden in the walls, in the shadows, not by ghosts, but by something far darker, something that had taken hold of that room long ago. And a year after that, another patient, another mute, had passed. Both died in silence, both with the same vacant, haunted eyes. They want me to come. No signs of trauma, no medical explanation for her collapse. But nothing made a difference. Eventually, Emily's body couldn't fight anymore, and she passed away quietly in her sleep. No struggle, no signs of pain. She simply stopped breathing, but the humming, it never stopped. It seemed to follow us around the ward, always there, in the background. The air was thick, and the walls seemed to close in around me. Her body went limp, and for a moment, I thought she had died. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse faint. I called for help, and the other nurses rushed in, but when they arrived, Emily was unresponsive again, as though nothing had happened. But that night, as I was doing my rounds again, I heard the humming once more. This time, it was louder. She wasn't alone. Standing in the corner was a figure, a tall, dark shape that seemed to blur at the edges, like a shadow not fully formed. I tried to call out to Emily, but my voice was lost in the oppressive silence. I stepped toward her, reaching out to pull her back, but as soon as I touched her, everything changed. The figure in the corner disappeared with a low, guttural hiss, and Emily collapsed into my arm. The doctors came and checked her over. They found nothing physically wrong with her. We moved Emily to a different room, but the noise followed. Over the next few weeks, Emily's condition worsened. She became more and more withdrawn, barely eating or drinking. I tried to comfort her, but nothing worked. We tried everything: medication, therapy, even hypnosis. It wasn't until after her death that we finally understood what had happened. The hospital had a long history of strange deaths in that room, too many to count. Some places, no matter how much time passes, never let go. Now, whenever someone asks me about the eerie things I've seen in psychiatric care, I think of Emily and the room she never truly left. I've worked in psychiatric care for over 2 decades, and let me tell you, you learn to expect the unexpected. People come into psychiatric hospitals with a range of conditions: PTSD, bipolar disorder, dissociative identity disorder, and, most of the time, you're able to make sense of things. But sometimes, there's something you just can't explain. Sometimes, the line between the real world and the things that lurk in the dark gets blurred in ways you never saw coming. It was one of those nights when nothing seemed right. I was working the late shift in the unit, typical evening, nothing out of the ordinary. The patients were all settled into their rooms, the lights dimmed, and the building was quiet except for the occasional distant hum of the air conditioning. But there was a subtle shift in the room. The temperature seemed to drop, and I noticed a faint smell, almost like wet, like something that hadn't been disturbed for too long. Then, I received the report about a new admission, a young man, barely in his mid-20s, transferred from a nearby facility. The silence between us stretched, uncomfortable, and I began to feel like I was intruding on something dark that I didn't fully understand. My name is Nurse Laura, but as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I approached Shaun's room again, I stopped in my tracks. The room was dim, but I could still make out Shaun sitting exactly where I had left him, still in the same position. But this time, he was no longer staring at the corner of the room. He was staring at the ceiling. His eyes were wide, but there was something unsettling about his gaze. His lips moved as if he were responding to someone, but there was no one there. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, I could hear a faint whispering. It wasn't Shaun's voice, it was a low murmur, barely audible, like someone was speaking to him from the dark. It was as if the whole hallway had shifted, like there was something just out of sight, something that wasn't quite right. "I'm here to take care of you. Do you want to tell me what happened?" The staff there couldn't manage his behavior any longer. I'd dealt with a lot of patients over the years, but something about Shaun made my skin crawl. I could feel the air in the room was heavier, thicker, as if something unseen was hanging between us. He had been non-responsive for days, his file marked with phrases like severe dissociation, complete disorientation, and hallucinations. According to the report, Shaun had been largely mute, showing no signs of communication for several weeks. When I walked into his room to introduce myself, my first impression was how unnervingly still he seemed. Shaun sat in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, his knees pulled up to his chest. His dark hair was unkempt, and his eyes were wide open but unblinking, like a doll's, eyes empty, but not quite vacant. His body was thin, his skin pale, and he wore that familiar hospital gown that seemed to swallow him whole. I stood there for a moment, unsure how to proceed. "Shaun," I said softly, taking a step closer. He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on some point in the corner, and he didn't flinch when I spoke his name. I knelt in front of him, trying to meet his gaze. "So okay, you're safe now. We'll help you." There was no reaction. I decided to leave him for the time being, heading to the nurse's station to prepare his medications and review his history further. Later that night, I made my rounds to check on all the rooms, ensuring that everything was calm. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. "Shaun," I said, my voice trembling just a bit, "are you okay?" His eyes didn't shift, but his lips parted, and I could barely hear him whispering, "They're here. They're watching me." "Who's watching you, Shaun?" I stepped closer, leaning in to hear him better. My heart raced, and I spun around, my eyes darting to the door. But when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. His voice had grown louder now, and he was repeating the same words over and over again. "They're here. They're watching me." The handle wouldn't turn. But before he could respond, the door behind me slammed shut, a forceful bang that made me jump. I turned back to Shaun, my mind racing. They were no longer vacant. They were filled with something ... dark. His pupils were dilated, and his gaze had shifted from the ceiling to me. His expression was twisted in something like terror, but there was something else, there unknowing, like he had seen something I couldn't. And then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence. I grabbed the door handle again, yanking it with all my strength, but it was as if the room had become trapped in time. I couldn't shake the feeling that Shaun hadn't left, that something had followed me, something that had been watching me, just as he had said. It was a presence I couldn't escape. The door wouldn't open. The sound is just below my hearing, like the soft murmur of a voice trying to get my attention. "I need you to listen to me, Shaun," I said, my voice sharp now. But there was no answer. I didn't stop running until I was back at the nurse's station. My hands were shaking, and I felt dizzy. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But I knew it wasn't just that. I turned back to him, and that's when I saw it. His eyes had changed. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to him, he whispered, "They've seen you too." Before I could respond, the door behind me opened with a sharp creak, and I rushed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, Shaun was gone. His bed was untouched, his clothes still neatly folded on the chair by the window. The room felt empty, and there was that same strange smell, stronger now, like wet earth. It was as if he had vanished. He wasn't in his room when I checked in on him, and no one could explain where he had gone. I searched the entire ward, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had never been there at all. Weeks passed, but the memory of that night lingered, and now, every time I walk down that hallway, I can still hear the faint whispering. But when I turn to look, there's never anyone there. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in psychiatric hospitals at night. It's not the peaceful silence you'd expect, no. It's a thick, heavy quiet that presses down on you, fills your ears. I've seen more than my fair share of bizarre, terrifying cases. The building was aging creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and rooms that seemed to have a permanent chill in the air. They called it the overflow unit, where the most dangerous or unmanageable patients were sent when the rest of the hospital was full. It was in one of those rooms that I met Lucas. It wasn't his physical appearance. It was a thin, unremarkable man with hollow eyes. It was the way he acted, the way he would stare at the walls, and occasionally murmur to them, as though they were alive. He would stare at the corner of his room, at the farthest point near the window, and his lips would move silently. I'd check on him during my rounds, and he wouldn't acknowledge me. His eyes would remain fixed on that corner, his expression blank but tense, like he was listening to something gore someone. His room 309, had an eerie stillness to it. No matter how much I cleaned, there was always a faint odor, like something old and forgotten. He was standing in the middle of the room, his hands clenched at his sides. He didn't speak, but his body trembled violently, as though he were being pulled in two directions. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the trembling stopped. He would just sit, staring at that corner of the room, as if waiting for something. And every time I entered, I felt a presence, something watching me. I dismissed it as paranoia after all. Working in a psychiatric ward long enough makes you sensitive to strange feelings. But this was different. This was tangible. He collapsed onto the bed, eyes rolling back into his head, breathing heavily. His body was rigid, his mouth open as if he was about to speak. But when I stepped closer, I could hear it. I couldn't make sense of it. What had just happened? Was it a psychotic break, or something more? A chill ran down my spine. I had worked here long enough to know that patients sometimes slipped into dissociative states, but this felt different. This felt wrong. Low, sibilant whispers, coming from the same corner of the room. It was so faint, so distant, that I almost convinced myself it was just the wind rattling the old windows. But there's one that still haunts me, something I can't shake, no matter how many years have passed. Diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and a history of violence, he had been admitted after an incident at another facility. There had been an outburst. He'd attacked another patient, and when the police arrived, they found him babbling incoherently about the ones who talk in the dark. He was nonverbal for days after his admission, but when he did speak, it was only in short, cryptic phrases. And makes every footstep feel like a violation of the stillness. I've worked as a psychiatric nurse for over 20 years. It was back when I worked in the North Wing, a section of the hospital that had been around since the 1950s. The next minute, he'd be pacing, his eyes wide with fear, muttering to himself about voices and shadows. He was always looking over his shoulder, like someone was watching him. Lucas was in his mid-30s, and his file was a mess of contradictions. His behavior was erratic. One minute he'd be sitting quietly in his room, rocking back and forth. I was assigned to care for him during my shifts in the North Wing, and from the moment I first met him, something about him unsettled me. At first, I thought it was just part of his condition, but over time, I began to notice something strange. Every night around 2 a.m., Lucas would sit up in his bed, his back straight as if someone had given him a jolt of energy. It got worse. On one particular night, I entered his room to check on him and saw something that I wish I could forget. "Lucas," I called softly, but he didn't respond. I stood there for a moment, watching him. His eyes were fixed on the corner, but his face had gone pale, as if the life had drained from him. "Lucas," I tried again, louder this time. His head snapped to the side, his eyes wide with terror. I rushed to his side, checking for any signs of distress, but his vitals were stable. Over the next few nights, his condition deteriorated. He wouldn't sleep. One night, after my shift ended, I decided to stay late, hoping I could catch whatever was happening to Lucas on camera. The staff had begun to worry about his behavior, and I was convinced it had something to do with the corner of his room. I set up a camera discreetly, pointing it toward the spot where he always looked. At 2 a.m., just as I had expected, Lucas sat up in bed. I watched the footage on my phone from the staff room, my heart pounding. He wasn't alone. In the corner, near the window, a shadow shifted. It was empty until I checked the records the next day that I found out something truly chilling. Lucas had died in the hospital several years ago, in the very room where he had been placed. The cause of death was a mystery, listed as but the whispers around the staff said it was a violent death, one that the hospital had tried to sweep under the rug. It wasn't just a play of light, it was a dark, shifting figure, its edges blurring like it was made of smoke. Sometimes, silence doesn't just mean absent, it means something else entirely. Something that lingers, something that waits. When I opened the door, the room was empty. Lucas was gone. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, do you want to forget to share this video with no one ever mentioned Lucas? But I would often hear strange whispers coming from that part of the building, and every time, I could swear it was his voice calling for someone to join him in the dark. There was no sign of him, no indication of where he had gone. The window was still locked, the door bolted shut, but the air was thick with that same presence, the same cold chill I had felt before. It hovered in the corner, barely perceptible but undeniably there. Lucas stood up, his body stiff, and began to walk toward it. I watched in disbelief as he moved closer, as though drawn by an invisible force. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, and then the camera went black. I rushed back to room 309, my heart racing. Lucas had been a patient who had died in the same room, and his soul, it seemed, had never left. I searched the entire wing, but he was nowhere to be found. The truth came out slowly over the course of the next few weeks. After that night, I was never able to work in that part of the hospital again. Room 309 was sealed off. I don't know if I truly believe in ghosts, but after that night, I'm not so sure I want to. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories, and remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video if you dare.